A question for the 70s. Can man survive? Here's one answer from the former chairman of Northeast Utilities and past president of the Atomic Energy Forum, Sherman Arnett.
I don't believe that man can survive if he continues on his present course. There are so many things that should be done in this world today that we're not doing. Perhaps the best example is right here in this building, the United Nations, where we play around with the idea of solving problems, but there are very few problems that have really been solved as a result of the work of the United Nations since they came into being in San Francisco. And frankly, I doubt if we really have the intestinal fortitude to face up to these things, and consequently, I can see our civilization coming to an end and perhaps the complete extinction of the human being.
The extinction of living creatures, some like human beings, mammals, will be the subject of this report on The Oceans and Man, produced by Walter McGraw for Group W, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, with Dr. Harry Shapiro of the American Museum of Natural History as consultant. I'm Garry Moore. Listen to the songs of the humpback whale, recorded 250 fathoms underwater. Listen because the singers may not be around much longer. There are in the oceans of the world some species of whale whose total numbers are in the dozens. All whales are threatened, but the controls on whaling are minimal and ineffective. Now, this is only one example of the way man is killing the oceans and their living creatures. Another example starts far inland. In upstate New York, producer Walter McGraw talked with Peter Tenna Ike, a fruit farmer who uses pesticides. How does he feel about the controversies about them?
Well, I feel that the fruit farmers and other users of pesticides are in a position where we're sort of helplessly standing on the sidelines while masses of people who don't have a great deal of knowledge about the problem and the situation are involved in a lot of conversation about what they're going to do about us, and that this has a big economic impact on what I'm going to be able to do in the future.
How important to your business are pesticides?
It's kind of difficult to say, having never gone without them for a whole year, but we have a fruit farmer who lives next door to us here who sprayed his trees religiously until an outside job transferred him to another community, and I try to keep track of his trees to see what happened to him the first year that he didn't spray them, and his damage exceeded 90% in the first year alone.
And it isn't, as many people seem to indicate, just a matter of cosmetics, the fact that people have been trained to want an apple that looks like it comes out of the Ladies' Home Journal.
Yeah, I think that's true. I have to pay people to grow and to harvest apples, so it costs me the same to grow each bushel of apples. And see, it isn't a question of whether it's fit to eat or it's not fit to eat. There's a lot that fall in the in-between area. There's enough apples, there's enough supply, so it isn't a question of whether you buy a bad one or a good one. There's enough good ones so that no bad ones would be sold at all. You never see apples that are bad for sale at less money. It's just a question they don't get sold at all.
Across the continent, Walter McGraw talked to Franklin Gress, who is working on his Ph.D. in zoology at the University of California at Berkeley. His main interest is in the brown pelican.
Breeding records on Anacapa Island, which is the only place where they breed in California now, are very scant. They're far and few between, so all we can do is get rough estimates, but we know that, there's been up to 2,000 birds nesting on the island at some time or another, and several hundred young being hatched out. I can't give precise figures, but you would normally expect several hundred young. Last year there were only 5 young from about 1,200 nesting pairs, and this year out of about 550 nesting pairs, there was only 1 young.
One young, that's right.
Why? What's happening? We have huge amounts of DDT found in the tissues and the egg yolks of these birds. They're all laying very, very thin-shelled eggs, and they're so thin-shelled that they're just not capable of hatching out young. They are just being crushed in the nest under the weight of the incubating bird.
You say because of DDT. Has that definite link been established?
We have measured the amount of chlorinated hydrocarbons, in particular the DDT compounds, in the egg yolks. And we get a definite correlation between the amount of DDE in the egg yolk and the thickness of the shell. In other words, the thinnest shells have the most of the DDT residues in them, particularly DDE. DDE is the principal metabolite of DDT. In other words, DDT is ingested by marine organisms, and 90% of it, at least 90% of it, is broken down metabolically to DDE, and there it stays. It's just, as far as we know, there's no living organism that is capable of breaking down DDE. So it accumulates in the tissues of the birds, and we think that it probably inhibits one or two enzymes essential to the production of eggshells and the shell gland of the birds.
Is this a universal thing wherever pelicans are to be found at this point?
Pelicans in Florida, which is a different subspecies, are reproducing normally. However, their shells are thinner than normal, and it appears that they're eventually doomed to the same fate that the Anacapa pelicans are. Now, the pelicans in Mexico are also beginning to show the same effects as the birds in Anacapa, but not to the degree that the Anacapa birds are.
But they are going in that direction.
It appears so, yes.
How long do you give the pelican under present situations, then?
Well, it's very difficult to say because it's not really killing the pelicans, it's just the pelicans aren't able to reproduce. The pelicans may live to be 20 to 30 years old. We don't really know how long they live. So it is possible that somehow, if the environment were clean once again, which doesn't seem likely, that perhaps the pelicans could reproduce normally again.
So, what did a brown pelican ever do for you? Well, birds and mammals share similar sex hormones and have much the same apparatus for regulating their metabolism. We've all heard of coal miners who carry canaries with them. Just maybe mankind has been carrying a brown pelican with it. Now, what is the connection between a fruit farmer who uses pesticides on an inland farm and the ocean? A river, that's what. But the river often does not go directly into the ocean. Here is Eugene Jensen, the Director of Operations of the U.S. Office of Water Quality.
You have to go through an estuary before you get to an ocean. A free-flowing stream transforms itself into an estuary at that point in which it begins to interact with the tide. And when that happens, you begin to form a sort of a pollutant trap. Materials can be held in these estuarine environments for months and perhaps years, so that the major impact of inland pollution will be felt first and largest in the estuary rather than in the ocean. Eventually, of course, material is transported out of the estuaries and into the ocean environment. Some of this is in the form of water, some of it's in the form of sediments. But if we had no estuaries, we'd have no shrimp, no crab, no oysters. Many of our ocean species of fish and shellfish simply rely on the estuary for a part of their life cycle or for a part of their food chain. So without the estuaries, we would lose great chunks of our ocean food resources.
Most DDT is spread by the air, but much of it gets into our rivers and flows down into estuaries. And there it can kill baby fish and shellfish. And how are our ocean fish doing? Dr. Paul Ehrlich is professor of biological science at Stanford University.
We've had very, very frightening things going on in the oceans. In fact, last year, for the first time since 1950, there was an absolute decrease in the amount of fishes taken out of the ocean. A 1% decrease in the fishing operations of the overdeveloped nations and a 4 or 5% decrease in the underdeveloped nations. Now, we have been predicting optimistically that it would probably be 1980 before we began to take absolute losses in our fisheries yield. The fact that absolute losses have come up now 10 or 11 years before we expected them indicates the situation in the ocean is even more serious than we had guessed, particularly when you remember that these losses were taken in the face of tremendously expanded efforts at fishing which have been going on over the last decade.
Lester Brown is a senior fellow with the Overseas Development Council.
The DDT problem illustrates how little we know of some of the things we're doing. In 1948, Dr. Paul Hermann Mueller, a Swiss scientist, was awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering DDT. At that time, no one had any inkling of what the consequences of using DDT would be. Unfortunately, the same thing is true of many of the other thousands of chemicals that we are dumping into the environment, either in the form of pesticides or industrial waste or any of many other forms.
Yes, DDT is only one substance we dump into our oceans, along with sewage, industrial wastes, mercury, oil, poison gases, atomic wastes, you name it. Recently, Dr. Lamont Cole, professor of ecology at Cornell, talked about this in one of a series of lectures called Can Man Survive? At the American Museum of Natural History.
The only reason there's oxygen in our atmosphere is that green plants keep putting it there. The green plants take in carbon dioxide and water and use the energy of sunlight in this process of photosynthesis to produce oxygen, and then we take in the oxygen and use it to burn organic matter and give off carbon dioxide. Now, the great bulk of the oxygen, at least the important oxygen, is produced in the oceans by the so-called marine phytoplankton, microscopic floating green plants. It's perfectly true that a forest or a woodland can produce a lot of oxygen, but when this grass or whatever is eaten by an animal or burned or when it decays, it uses up the same amount of oxygen that was produced in its formation. So the trick in compensating for this oxygen that is used in burning coal and petroleum and natural gas is to have green plants produce the oxygen and then have the bodies of these green plants sequestered somewhere without being oxidized. This can happen in swamps and bogs and marshes and oxygen-free sediments of lakes. But the really big repository is in the marine sediments. And according to my calculations, at least 70% of all of the oxygen released each year on Earth does come from the marine phytoplankton. And yet the oceans are the sink for 500,000 different types of chemicals. If we should inadvertently release something that turned out to be a deadly poison for the marine phytoplankton, our atmosphere would start running out of oxygen for us to breathe. A really frightening paper came out about a year ago from Charles Worcester at the State University of New York, who found that low concentrations of DDT, about 1/10 of a part per million, would severely inhibit the photosynthesis of marine phytoplankton. Now, if this turns out to be a general phenomenon, we may already be in trouble, because even if we stopped all use of DDT tomorrow, it would continue washing into the oceans for a number of years, and most of it would go into these coastal regions, which are much more productive of life than the open ocean is.
You want to feel nervous? DDT concentrates at the bottom of Lake Michigan are 8.5 of 1/10 of a part per million. We are 85% of the way along, at least in Lake Michigan. How are our estuaries and oceans doing? Well, in summary, Lester Brown.
One can put DDT in the biosphere in one part of the world, and eventually, through the circulation of air and water in the biosphere, it spreads around the entire world. One can find DDT today in the body tissues of penguins in Antarctica, in the bodies of children in the villages of Thailand, or in mother's milk in the state of Indiana. And yet we find this a very difficult problem to deal with. Difficult because in some places there are no economic alternatives to the use of DDT for the control of pests on food crops or for the control of malaria. Now this is significant because we're faced here with a trade-off between the quantity and the quality of life. We can either have more Indians in the world, to put it very simply, Or we can sacrifice the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon and a lot of other species that are being affected by DDT in the environment, including quite possibly man.
Two other points. Those who defend the continued use of DDT point out that 25 years ago, Greece, for instance, had 2 million cases of malaria a year. Last year, it had only 7. But some mosquitoes that carry malaria have become resistant to DDT, while some mammals have been found to get cancer from it. And there are safe but more expensive substitutes for DDT. Naturally, we're still manufacturing and using DDT. But that isn't all we dump into our oceans. Recently, we were told that we have a dead sea off New York. Director Jensen knows about that.
I was personally involved in some studies that were started there some 3 or 4 years ago. I think the evidence on it is pretty convincing that we do, in fact, have such a dead area off the Sandy Hook area. The bottom conditions on it are apparently such that life simply cannot exist there.
But the problem is not limited to one isolated spot. Again, Dr. Cole.
Some of you will recall the accounts of the shock expressed by Thor Heyerdahl, and he is drifting across the Atlantic to find the mid-ocean so visibly polluted with globules of unknown composition that the men were reluctant to dip their toothbrushes in the water. In the Pacific, some unknown factor has set off a population explosion of a formerly rare starfish which gobbles up coral reefs. This is killing the living corals on Guam at a reported rate of a half mile per month, and it's also at work in the Indian Ocean and on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. When the living corals are killed, the fish quickly disappear from the region, and the land becomes especially susceptible to erosion by wave action. So some of these islands in the Pacific may literally disappear as a result of whatever man did to set off this explosion, because there's no question in my mind but that man is responsible. We don't know what started this. There are as many theories as people have worked on it. Well, I don't think anybody knows, but we do know that an ecological disaster is underway.
Ecological disasters are not only caused by what we put into the oceans, but also by what we keep out of the oceans. Dr. Charles Kellogg is the Deputy Administrator for the Soil Conservation Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The Aswan Dam. I was afraid of it from the beginning. The Nile was traditionally a fertile valley because it got the sediment from the high mountains, both organic and inorganic, from relatively young rocks, mainly basaltic rocks, and it was this silt spread over the fields that kept the Nile a famous fertile valley all during the centuries. All right, you built the dam, and all of that stuff stayed above the dam. Not only that, there was not so much pressure against the Mediterranean, so the Mediterranean Sea is pushing back into the delta and making that land salty. Further, the organic material is denied the fish, and the fish production is very low now in the eastern Mediterranean. I'm sorry, I doubt that dam should have been built, but I thought so at the time, and you can imagine how big a voice I had in Egypt.
It has been said that the oceans belong to nobody, and therefore belong to everybody. But how does everybody control everybody? How do Portuguese sardine fishermen control a dam being built inland on the Nile River, even though that dam takes away their livelihood and food for millions? International control? Well, David Dominic is the acting administrator of the Office of Water Quality.
I think it's coming, and coming rapidly. Perhaps not rapidly enough to suit some of us, but it's on the horizon. Secretary Youthon has called for the year 1972 to be a year in which the United Nations engages in intensive work, study, meetings, and agreements on environmental problems. President Nixon has taken the initiative for this country and has proposed to the NATO countries of Europe that we engage in discussions and bilateral agreements on environmental problems. One of the most specific areas that needs to be attacked, and attacked immediately, is the question of the oceans and what is being done to pollute or degrade the oceans. And the most specific area of concern is in the discharge of oil, either through accidental spills or through negligent practices on the part of tankers of all nations. And there are conventions underway at the present time to try and reach international agreement to prohibit the discharge of oil in the oceans. And this is just one example of many that we've got to enter into with other nations to look at our environment as a global question and not as a nationalistic question. It doesn't take too much imagination to realize that our pollution is contributing to the pollution of other countries, and what other countries are doing contributes to our problems here as well.
Nations are preparing to talk about maybe doing something sometime. This must be a comfort to the brown pelicans, the bald eagles, the peregrine falcons, the blue whales, and us. The Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions is trying to hurry things along before it's too late. Dr. Harvey Wheeler, co-author of the novel Failsafe, is a senior fellow there.
It just won't be long before there are almost no fish at all. Recall that it was not but 5, 6, the most 10 years ago. So when you went to the market, your economy food was seafood, fish, salmon even in a can. That was cheap food, years ago. Can of salmon, yeah. That was what you made when you were poor. You made salmon sandwiches, buy a can of salmon now. That old cruddy pink salmon is 85 cents a can. 15 cents just a few years ago. The thing that I will predict is that even the common, ordinary table seafoods, red snapper, cod, and, of course, sole is already way out of sight. But the common table seafoods very, very quickly are going to become the extremely high-priced luxury items, and they will outprice filet mignon in a few years. Now, that's how bad the fisheries are, and they're just going to disappear. It's happened already, the blue whale, which is simply fished out of existence. There are a few of them left, but ecologists now tell us there are not enough left for them to maintain themselves, reproduce themselves. They're just going to die out completely. This helps illustrate something that provides us with an understanding of the distinction between the old politics of, say, conservationism and the new politics of ecology. Because there is one process that is at work in our society, in our culture today, that can be called ecocide. That means man killing his own environment. It's possible to pinpoint the procedure whereby ecocidal processes get started, and when you do that, then you know what the object of ecological politics is. And let me use this thing about the fisheries to describe it. It involves what a mathematician calls an asymptote. In ecology, we call this the ecocidal asymptote. It's a way of talking about two curves that rise at an exponential rate. That is, a curve that rises exponentially is one that starts out really very, very gradually, an imperceptible rise in the slope of the curve, and all of a sudden it gains speed, and it rises more and more rapidly until it virtually explodes. And an asymptote is two curves that rise in about the same rate and explode at about the same rate, and as they rise, they gradually come together, but they never quite meet. It's a word that means the falling together. Now, here's what happens in a typical ecocidal crisis, and it's illustrated by the depletion of the fisheries. Now, in the first place, you start out with unlimited resource, more fish in the ocean than anybody can count or dream of, riches in the land of plenty. But relatively small number of fishermen with relatively crude devices for harvesting the resource and for catching the fish. The little bit that they catch makes no visible dent on the supply. In fact, the natural enemies probably take a heavier toll than the human enemies. But as the catching increases and as the market for the resource for the fish grows, gradually a perceptible dent is made on the supply, and fishermen are finding less in their favorite spots than they used to find, and they're seeking for more and more places to get the same catch. And so the competition among them intensifies. And as that happens, then it's obvious that the world stock of the resource is beginning imperceptibly at first, but increasingly to decline. Well, that's still a very small beginning of these two curves, the curve of exploitation and the curve of the diminishing supply of the resource. But as the fishermen notice this decline, they scramble for more and more effective techniques and, different kinds of ways of finding where they are, sonar, radar, and all that. As this happens, the technology for depleting the resource is given a big shot in the arm, and it begins to rise at a very, very rapid rate in its sophistication. And as that happens, of course, the competition for the resource, the fish, increases in intensity, and as that happens, the supply that remains begins to diminish at a very rapid rate, and both of these began accelerating so rapidly at such a high rate that you find the point, and you could almost look in the pages of Fortune magazine and see this point illustrated. You find the point where the big exotic manufacturers of the harvesting equipment that use the latest ships and the latest sonar and the latest, ways of detecting that last little minnow of the supply have produced finally the most exotic, most sophisticated possible fish harvesting equipment, and they blast forth with it in the magazine saying, this is the last word, literally, and you better buy it now and get it now and do it in a hurry because there won't be any fish next year. And it's literally true. The point occurs, and this is the falling together of these 2 points of the existence of the resource and the development of the technology for depleting it. The most sophisticated equipment for harvesting the resource is produced at exactly the same point that the resource itself completely disappears. And that's the ecocidal asymptote. That's the death. This is something, of course, the entire world has an interest in. And if you think of all of the issues upon which the cooperation of the nations of the world is necessary, and if you list these issues, almost every issue list is one that is controversial, internationally controversial, difficult to get any agreement on, shot full of ideological conflicts. But the one thing you can say is that the ecology movement and ecological problems together make up a series of issues that are almost completely devoid of ideological taint, embarrassment, or contamination. They're not ideologically polluted issues. It seems to me that anyone who really seriously is concerned about international cooperation, world order, getting the preparations for world order underway, would flock to the ecological movement and try in every possible way to move it into the arena of world and international politics, because that's the way that the beginning institutions and practices and procedures, arrangements that will lead ultimately to world order, that's the way that they will come. There's almost no doubt about that. So people in any kind of beginning community or union, they're brought together by the common interests that they have and the things that they recognize as being impossible for them to do while they're still separate. That's the only thing that brings them into the union.
Maybe. But just in case we don't do things fast enough, let's take another listen to the song of the humpback whale. That was recorded by Dr. Roger S. Payne. Now, if you want to try to keep alive the song of the whale, write to Whales, Post Office Box 131, Del Mar, California. The zip code is 92014. Our next report will be on The Atom and Man, produced by Group W, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, with Dr. Harry Shapiro of the American Museum of Natural History as consultant. Can Man Survive is written and produced by Walter McGraw. Bill Kaland is the executive producer. I'm Garry Moore.